just gonna record, and we're recording. And we're lucky to have with us today Dr. Alison van Eanennaam, who is a cooperative extension specialist in the Department of Animal Science at the University of California, Davis, and runs the Animal Genomics and Biotechnology Laboratory. And she served on national committees such as, I always forget what USDA stands for. It's United States Department of Agriculture, National Advisory Committee on Biotechnology in the 21st Century, and was awarded the 2014 Borlaug, I'm not sure how to say that, CAST Communication Award. And you also write the biobeef blog. That's right, isn't it?
That's right. Yep.
Welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me, Ali. Probably the first cattle geneticist you've ever spoken to.
Certainly the first cattle geneticist I've knowingly spoken to, yes. Yeah, so cattle genetics, can you kind of sum up what you've been up to recently and what your main area is?
Sure. So I work in, as was mentioned previously, extension, which is kind of taking science to the farmers. And my particular area of interest is improved genetics of cattle, beef and dairy. And I mean, I guess what I've been up to, I would say perhaps what the field has been up to in the last 50, 100 years is dramatically improving the efficiency of milk and beef production. And I think that's kind of a really, not many people know the story of how genetics has improved the sustainability of our environmental footprint of our food production. And that's what I'm really passionate about. And my particular lab focuses on trying to improve genetics of health of animals and using some of the more advanced breeding techniques, the controversial ones like gene editing, to introduce useful genetic variation to our livestock breeding programs.
Very interesting. I mean, there's a lot of misinformation that goes around about livestock in general, and I would say that there's a kind of extreme position that some people take that having livestock at all is amoral, and I'm guessing by the line of work you're in that you don't think that, and I honestly think that's probably only held as a position by a very small number of people. But I think there's a lot more people who probably wonder whenever they're buying meat really about how that animal lived and how much suffering was going on during the life of the animal, and whether there's an environmental impact that could be alleviated by them just not buying that meat at all. So I wonder, I mean, they're big subjects, but I mean, maybe you could pick up a little bit on where your work fits in with that.
You want me to address all that in one sentence, or? So I guess I'll go with the easy one, which is kind of the environmental end of things. And that's just because I'm very familiar with that. And I think that is a message that gets really distorted out in the general media. And, you know, animal agriculture in general is the source of a lot of misinformation, let alone biotechnology and animal ag. So my entire career has been kind of fighting the misinformation that's out there, because it's so easy for a marketer to make a soundbite that sounds like that might be reasonable. And basically it's kind of, they're tricking you into buying more expensive product because they kind of scare you into thinking that what you're currently buying is bad. And I see this a lot with like GMOs and gluten-free kind of products that had no opportunity to ever have gluten in them in the first place. It's kind of this fear-based marketing that it surrounds a lot to do with animal agriculture, I think. So as it relates to the environmental footprint, and that's one you often hear, and cows particularly get like slammed for that. And you'll often hear, well, cows are really inefficient at converting feed to edible protein, and we'd be better eating that feed ourselves. And that's a great argument if what the cows are eating is human edible. But for the most part, cows, their magic skill is they have a rumen, which is a great big vat of microbes that can take indigestible cellulose, i.e. grass, and convert it into highly nutritious source of food, i.e. beef or milk. And that is kind of just ignored, the fact that what their magic superpower is converting inedible food into highly nutritious food. And so if you ignore the fact that they have the rumen, you're missing the point of cows and ruminants more generally on Earth. And I do think if you look at the progress that's been made in terms of genetics over the last 50 years, like a glass of milk today in the United States, the environmental footprint of that glass of milk is about 1/3 of what it was in the 1950s. And you might go, oh, that can't be true. And it's like, it is, because we've dramatically decreased the number of dairy cows needed to provide milk for the US through the application of improved genetics, which means that each cow produces more milk, and therefore we need less cows to produce the same amount of milk. And collectively, that means we use something like 20 million less cows. I think we have 9 million dairy cows in the US now, providing the milk for everybody, and using less land, producing less manure, and with a 1/3 environmental footprint of what it was in the 1950s. And so that's where kind of science plays into reducing the environmental footprint of our animal protein production. And that's really the area that I'm passionate about.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's really succinctly put. But on the other hand, those two facts, the fact that when you're making beef, you feed cows predominantly, and the figure I've heard from your colleague, Frank Mitlener, is something like 90%, or maybe it was another person, but someone was saying 90% of the food in a beef cow's life, even if it's finished with grain, 90% of the food it gets would be human inedible, and quite often are byproducts of plants that humans eat the edible part of, that would only be thrown away otherwise and left to rot.
Yeah, and I mean, it so much depends on your environment and which country you're in. So that's not at all true that, like, we don't finish cattle in Australia on grain for the most part. They're finished on pasture, and that, I think, probably you're in Scotland.
That's right.
You're probably for the most part grass finishing there as well. And so they're probably not getting finished on any human edible feed. Whereas intensively raised animals with the Corn Belt in the United States, which is the competitive advantage of this environment, they often spend their last 90 days on corn, and that finishes them more rapidly, which reduces their environmental footprint too. And so there's pros and cons to, both systems of finishing them. But our dairy cows here in California, we have quite a big population. They eat a lot of things like almond hulls that are not human edible, and they're very high source of protein, and the rumen does its magic and converts it into milk, and that really is the value of ruminants. And I think that, especially, and another really interesting point that I often see is, if you look at global averages for like the environmental footprint of a pound of beef, it really is so driven by the environment. If you have a low efficiency production system and you're basically not feeding that animal anything very nutritious, it takes them a very long time to get to market, they don't produce very much product, you can dramatically increase the amount of greenhouse gases associated for example, a steak in Ethiopia. Versus if you're looking at a dairy cow who's also produced a whole bunch of milk over her lifetime, the environmental footprint associated with a hamburger off a dairy cow is dramatically lower, because you've amortized her emissions, if you will, across a much bigger amount of animal protein. And so dairy beef particularly has a really low environmental footprint compared to, for example, a beef animal in sub-Saharan Africa or something like that. And so it's really have to look at your environment, and that really dramatically it alters what you can grow and what the competitive advantage of different animal source proteins and vegetable source proteins are for human consumption.
Yeah, and the calls sometimes you hear to reduce beef consumption in order to reduce overall footprint. I think there's a couple of issues potentially there, in that, you have to weigh up the environmental footprint of having to use more plants and the monocultures and that, and their environmental footprints, but also it ignores this notion that the more care you take to scientifically improve the efficiency of ruminant production systems, the more bang for your buck you get. And there's a problem in third world countries of protein malnutrition pretty much across the board. So well-meaning calls to reduce environmental footprints are to be taken seriously, and they're all well and good. But it comes up against this problem of hunger and malnutrition, and there's a case to be made for actually getting more ruminants who have been bred in a much more efficient system so that people have the protein they need, but in a way that's as environmentally kind as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two worlds in this planet, right? I think there's the well-fed first world that have their own set of issues, and there's the malnourished developing world that have a really separate set of issues. And I find you almost have to speak about the problem separately, because it doesn't make sense to make an argument in the first world in the third world. And I think if you've ever seen intellectual stunting from children that haven't had access to sufficient protein or sufficient micronutrients for their brains to cognitively form in a way that gives them normal intellect, it's something you don't unsee. And having traveled through the developing world and seen in a country where a mother will have several children, and she'll choose one child that's going to be the sacrificial child that she'll dramatically reduce any intake for, so that can be the child she goes begging with. How does a mother make that kind of a choice? And I think when you see that, and then you hear, a well-fed activist in the first world saying that for example, we should all get rid of cows. It's kind of like, that doesn't make sense. But that's a very different proposition if you're in a first world country where you're potentially eating too much, animal source proteins. And so I think both can be true. And it kind of dichotomizing it into black and white is not very helpful. And I think all agriculture is locally based, depending upon the needs of that community and what you can grow in that community. And sometimes ruminants are the best source of animal source proteins in the developing world, because there's no other feed source that's available to monogastric, single stomached animals like pigs and chickens. Yeah. They kind of eat the same stuff we do. And so they kind of more directly compete. And so if you've got a goat that can go out and eat cellulose, then that might be the best source of animal source protein for that particular individual. So I think there's a lot of things that come into it, and it gets kind of it's the first world perspective tends to kind of dominate sometimes. And I think the recommendations that get made are quite dangerous. It's also, this is a really interesting point. If you look at cows, there's about a billion and a half or so on Earth. The country that has the largest number of cows is which one?
I would guess Brazil.
Nope.
Maybe it's one of the big African countries like Nigeria.
Nope.
Okay, I'm stumped.
India.
Wow.
So over 350 million cows or so.
Wow.
And of course, there you've got the religious prohibition on the consumption of beef. So they do produce a lot of dairy. In fact, I think they're the number one dairy producing country in the world. But they don't produce very much beef from all those cows. And so it's always intriguing to me when you hear people talking about the environmental footprint of cows, that they use the kind of the global numbers, but then they just kind of conveniently ignore the biggest population that's not very productive, because it kind of can't be, because it's literally a sacred cow. And it just brings up all of these contradictions. And it's like, well, who gets to choose whether a cow should be eaten for meat or not? And should religion dictate that? And does that give them a pass for their 350 million? The second biggest is Brazil, to your point, in terms of cow numbers. And they're about a little bit twice the US population. They're about 220 or so, but they produce less beef than the US population, which is half the number. And so there's all these different trade-offs, and then that makes sense to some extent because they have a different environment. Those cows tend to be more tropically adapted animals, like the Nelore breed, and they have different yields of beef relative to the animals that we can raise in the US. And so I'm not recommending that the US system works everywhere, but certainly there's a yield gap in many countries where you could increase the productivity of the existing animals, and that would reduce the environmental footprint of milk and meat production in those countries. And often it's just very simple animal husbandry things like, a balanced nutrition or a better feed. But that's not always that easy to achieve, and especially Africa. It's like, there may not be better feed available, and if there was, the people would be eating it. And so, sometimes those cows just are scavengers out there, and they kind of make do. And yeah, they're not productive, but they're getting by, and they're producing something where there would be nothing otherwise. And they're a form of draft and manure and a banking system. They provide so much more than hamburgers, and I find it kind of demeaning to think of a cow as just a hamburger. It does a lot more than that for the world.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and that's a fascinating point about India, where probably a lot of people would point to India as there's a lot of vegetarians there, and maybe as a beacon of hope for environmentalism. But that's actually something that I'd not heard before. That's amazing. The kind of another kind of interface between first and third world. Brazil's not a third world country, but it's deregulated in a lot of ways, and it seems to be a touch point for first world environmentalists talking about rainforest clearance, and that's a totally understandable concern. And the what's going on there seems to be potentially pretty devastating. I don't know if you've got much to say about that.
I certainly not my area of particular expertise, but I have been to Brazil and seen what's happening and know what the export numbers are. And I think it's the story you hear is it's the cows. And actually it's kind of more complicated than that. So in speaking to the farmers down there, that often the driver for the initial clearing of the forests is the timber, and getting income from that timber. Once the timber's removed, then typically they'll go in and grow soy. And soy, of course, is a very big export from Brazil, and we know which big, large or group of countries imports a lot of soy, and they export a lot of soy to the EU, and that's pretty much to feed the monogastrics in the EU, so the pigs and the chickens, because soy has this unique amino acid profile that provides essential amino acids that are important for those monogastrics, which then of course become food in the EU. And then, as I've been told, it tends to be farmed in a way that's not very sustainable for the soil. And then once they can no longer grow soy there, then the cows will move in and provide nutrition or manure and fertilizer, and kind of it'll go to cattle at that stage. And yet, if I look at the way that the environmental footprinting gets done, that all gets kind of put on cows. And they're part of it, sure. But I think that actually the driver isn't necessarily the cows. They come in kind of after the other things have happened. And so a lot of that is soy getting grown to be exported to other countries. And China's, I think, the biggest soy importer, and EU, I believe, is second. And that drives those populations there. And those are the monogastrics that are directly competing with feed that could have otherwise gone to humans. Whereas cows don't really eat soy. It's not really part of their diet, and you can feed it, but it's not, because they have the rumen. If you give them a perfect protein, it just gets broken down by the bacteria, so it's no use. You waste it. So it's only the monogastrics that need those essential amino acids. The cows can get it from the bacteria, which is basically what they're digesting. And after the rumen, the bacteria die, and that becomes cow food, right? That's kind of how rumens work. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think that you have to kind of understand global trade and where different things are going and why those pressures are there and why are those farmers doing that in the first place. And often it's because of an economic need, that they need income. And so if you can get a system of farming going that gives them an adequate income, then you basically remove that push to take the forest. And so sustainability isn't just environmental, right? It has to have an economic component whereby those farmers have an income and are able to feed their own families. And if you can't do that, that's going to be the driver. That, you know, if your family's hungry, I don't care what the environmental implications are, you're going to do something to get food for you and your family, and that has to be the first thing that gets solved in these equations.
Yeah, and I think the lumping of chicken and pork in with cows happens all the time. So it comes under this umbrella of meat, when in fact the dynamic's quite different. Like you say, you know, the feeding pattern of monogastric animals is quite different from cows.
Yeah, well, and often I'll see, well, I don't know, the feed conversion ratios. I think cows are like 7-1 or something, and chickens are, I don't know, 3-1, and fish are almost 1-1. And it's like, yeah, but they're eating really different things. So it's the 7 might be 7 that couldn't have been done anything else with, whereas the 3 might directly compete with something you could have put down your throat, right? And so I think, and so I'm not bashing monogastrics. I mean, they're an important source of the whole protein system as well, but they also have a different ecological niche to the ruminants, and that's where I think ruminants are getting a bad rap without really kind of an appreciation of what they can eat and their role in providing ecosystem services in a way that a chicken just can't.
And what do you think is the great big goal or hope for genetic technology for ruminants? And where do you see the technology? How far do you see the technology taking us? You know, we're producing more dairy with far fewer cows. You know, what do you think is the most exciting thing on the horizon?
Well, I mean, if you look at the rate of genetic progress in our animal breeding programs, we kind of click along at a pretty consistent rate every year. So that we have these breeding objectives, and every year we improve. You know, we select the best cows and the best bulls, or the best roosters and hens, and we just kind of have been clicking along, and we haven't seemed to hit a plateau at this stage. And I think if you look at the history of animal breeding, what's been the big innovations, it's really anything you can do to use the best genetics more widely. So artificial insemination, which is a relatively non-controversial technology, which just basically means you're using semen from the very best animals to be the dads of the next generation. That dramatically increased the rate of genetic improvement in our livestock species. And if you look at dairy cows, you know, once that breeding method was introduced, you had a much more rapid increase because you could use best genetics more widely. And that was, you know, artificial insemination. It sounds bad, right? So it was actually met with quite a lot of opposition back in the 1950s by the public, who didn't like research to do with sex, and you know, competing farmers. So farmers that sold bulls are like, well, damn, if you can buy semen in a straw, you're not going to buy my bull. I'm going to try and say that your stuff's going to give you Franken calves, and, you know, and I'm going to create fear around what you're doing because you're threatening my business. It's a little bit like Uber and taxis, right? It's like, yeah, it was a fundamental change, and there aren't as many bull breeders around. And if you think about it, I mean, if you're really concerned about reducing animal numbers, there's probably no technology that's more dramatically decreased dairy cow numbers than artificial insemination, because we need less cows to produce the same amount of milk. And so you might even argue that animal breeders are, getting rid of dairy farmers and dairy cows. And so, that's not a narrative you hear very often, but there are always trade-offs and consequences and winners and losers in technology like that. And so when you have a breeding method introduced that accelerates the rate of genetic gain, it has these knock-on effects that are great for the environment, but maybe not for a farmer or a bull seller, because you've altered the business model to disadvantage them potentially. And I think sometimes we want these win-win-win-win-win scenarios. And it's like, life's not really like that for the most part. And you just have to acknowledge, well, these are the trade-offs, and which aspect of sustainability am I the most married to? Do I want, is the environment the most important thing for me? Is it the economic viability of farmers the most important? Is it the price to the consumer? Is it the ability for poor people to have access to food? Is it the animal welfare? Because they kind of compete against each other a little bit, and you always try to look for this nirvana in the middle where it's a win-win-win, but they're rare to get, and I think those trade-offs are often kind of just ignored by marketers that say, oh, you need to buy my product because it's got this attribute of, which is one aspect of sustainability, but they kind of mum on what that did to the other two legs of sustainability. Like it might have, increased the environmental footprint and made it more difficult for the farmer to stay in business, but it fits some sort of need that the consumer is looking for. And I think that's unfortunately not a very nuanced conversation. And so people will make decisions that they think is in the best interests of an animal or is in the best interests of sustainability. But if you actually look at the decisions, they're actually voting against their own stated interests in like decreasing the environmental footprint of their food production. And you kind of look at it and you just think, you've been tricked by business, because they haven't acknowledged what the trade-offs are that you're buying.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's funny, like in an attempt to do the right thing, you can end up with the turkeys voting for Christmas. And something that you hear a lot is in an attempt to sort of stifle debate and maybe dismiss nuance around the subject of beef production and that sort of thing, is that the meat lobby, so-called, is very powerful. And I don't really know one way or another whether there is such a single unit, but I know that any industry would be remiss if they didn't try to, influence policy in their favor. But also, like you're talking about now, it isn't a monolith. One part of the industry can see massive innovations and then another part suffers because of it. So what do you think about food lobbying in general in America, and how have you seen much in terms of different meat producers, different vegetable producers, grain producers? What do you think that landscape's actually like?
Well, I mean, I think I always, big meat, right? Big meat's got to you, and it's like, what is this big meat? It's like, sounds kind of scary. Working in my field, I get accused of all sorts of conflicts of interest with, biotechnology companies and Monsanto. And it's like, that's not how like public sector academics work. It's like, the science says this, sorry if you don't like it and it doesn't it hurts your business, tough, that's just life. And I think that what I see a lot is that it's really the marketers that are, I actually think they're my enemy, because I come to work each day trying to use science to improve the efficiency of agriculture, because I'm passionate about not having that lady with that little baby not being able to feed it and having to starve it so that she can feed her other kids. I think that's just, and I don't understand why 20,000 people die of hunger today and no one seems to give a shit. That's just a mystery to me, why that's not a driving, that's like what, 3 or 4 jumbo jets going crashing every day and no one gives a rip. And so that seems to be not of interest to anyone. But even if you don't care about those people, but you do care about the environmental footprint of agriculture, then agricultural science should be your best friends, because if you look at what the impact is, it's really, really big. And the marketers are actually working against us, and trying to put out that their system is better than the more efficient systems. And so they can make a sweeping statement about, from now on, all of our, I don't know, chickens are going to eat non-GMO feed or something like that. And overnight, you've just dramatically affected, in a bad way, the sustainability of agriculture. And they just make these arbitrary decisions to try to, and then they have to tell the consumer why they're doing that. So they make up these fear-mongering stories about it. And then they sell a higher priced product that's less efficiently produced. And they've negated everything I spent my whole day doing. And I can't even go in the grocery store anymore, because the absence labels, they just drive me insane. And business is tricking people into making bad purchasing decisions in the grocery store. And if you understand agriculture, you also will have a hard time shopping in the grocery store, because the misinformation and the fear-mongering and the price differential for these less efficient systems, people, it's like, what are you people doing? You're getting tricked by business. It's just tragic, and it works against the long-term sustainability of agriculture. So if you're successful at eliminating, for example, a product from let's use GMOs in Europe, it's probably as good an example of anything. So that's gone from the market. So no one has that competitive advantage that their product is missing whatever it is, this evil thing. But none of the farmers have access to that technology either. And so that technology is gone. So you've got this long-term lingering effect on not having farmers have access to things like insect-protected crops. So they have to keep spraying insecticides and the like. But nobody's getting a business advantage. And so all you did in the long run is hurt the sustainability of agriculture and farmers' access to useful innovation. So I'm glad you had your 2 years of, getting your market advantage, but you're not actually working towards the future sustainability of our planet. And I think that most consumers actually do give a shit about that. And yet they're being tricked into buying these absence labeled product, not really appreciating that has these long, really big reaching implications into the ability of Africa, for example, to use that technology. And there's this kind of knock-on effect that people don't really own when they kind of make these choices, because those trade-offs aren't discussed very much.
Yeah, that is fascinating. The whole debate around GMO, genetically modified crops, it kind of pulses up every now and again, and you see it in the media, and you get, I don't think the media really help, because I don't think they want to delve too deep. They use terms like frankenfoods, and I think the science is very badly put across. I mean, maybe you could summarize the major concerns and why they shouldn't have got in the way of using GMO.
Well, I mean, from a scientific perspective, often you'll hear there's safety concerns. It's just not. Every scientific society in the world agrees on that. And so why has it got to a stage where 60% of the people think it's dangerous, and the scientists just say there's no data there? We've got 20 years of data showing nothing going on there. And I think it's a little bit like the vaccine debate, right? Yeah. So how do you get the public opinion so out of whack with where the scientific data is? And as a scientist, I think it's the most frustrating thing on earth to see people intentionally endangering their own children's health or making bad choices about agricultural production systems based on misinformation. And if you look at it, and I've battled with this my whole career, it is getting spread by competing business interests, at least in the case of GMOs. And the media does a really bad job, because they present alternative viewpoints as if it's a 50-50 thing. Like, well, it could be safe, but this guy says it's unsafe. And, this guy's some guy on a couch that has no expertise, or worse, a marketer that's selling you an absence label product that doesn't contain that nasty stuff, for more money, of course. And then it's put out there, and the scientists just kind of have to stick to the science and can't say, hey, you're full of shit, you boy. What you're saying is not true, and you're making money off this claim. And so now it's become so politicized that I think it's well, I don't want to analogize it to climate change, but a similar thing was done there, where people that said it wasn't happening were put up as if, well, it's a 50-50 proposition, and the science is, it's 98 versus 2 kind of. It's not 100, but it's dramatically the majority. And so with the GMO discussion, I think it's become a proxy for people's concerns about other things to do with the food supply. It's not really about a breeding method anymore, and why would you not want farmers to have access to disease-resistant plants? Why is that? Whose interest is that in? And the disease resistance, the insect-protected plants, I mean, they've been demonstrated to dramatically decrease chemical use in agriculture. So why would anyone be working against those? And that's where I think this kind of people not appreciating that their opposition is actually having a negative effect on their so-called environmental interests. They don't really appreciate it because those trade-offs aren't discussed, and usually they'll invoke a boogeyman, Monsanto, or big cow, or the man's trying to screw you over, and I'm here to protect you, and here, buy my product and you'll be safe. And it's the oldest con man, and it's the oldest con trick in the world, right? And so here's my snake oil that'll help you get cured from whatever, without kind of really having any evidence that it works, or that what you're railing against was bad. And I think that narrative has been really hard to break with evidence, and clearly we've done a horrible job. And that's kind of one of the reasons I got involved in science communication is, can we do a better job somehow appealing to people's shared values, which is environmental footprint of food production, and show that actually what they're doing is working against the kind of the efforts of the scientists to try to improve the environmental footprint.
So, I mean, it is fascinating to think, because I think everyone has this, or many people have this image of big meat, big cow, the sort of the shadowy, influential figure in the corridors of power in Washington, passing envelopes filled with who knows what, steaks probably, to congressmen and senators. And what you're saying is that the dominant force really in all this is companies trying to make money, regardless of the truth.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I can necessarily say that about I mean, it's a different discussion, I think, with the cows, and I'm not sure, I don't know enough of the dynamics in terms of the competing business interests with cows, but I've certainly seen some misinformation getting put out there around the environmental impact of cows. So, in terms of globally, what's the environmental impact of cows? Like, just give me a number.
Yeah, well,
of greenhouse gas emissions on Earth, how much is cows?
So you see the old livestock's long shadow paper going around, which had to be corrected, and it said that animal agriculture, I think animal agriculture rather than agriculture overall, was around 15%.
So animal ag is around 14.5 according to the latest data, and of that, the cows are around about 9%. So that's mostly due to methane, which is those magic bugs taking cellulose through to digestible food. And so that's basically the number that's true, and that's 1 billion cows or so producing dairy and beef. So it's all of the cattle-based food production. But then I'll see numbers that are put out by competing business interests that are trying to specifically go after cows, that they're responsible for like 50% or something like that. And it's like, no, it's actually that the number is what the number is, and it's not that. And so I find if you've got a competing product that you want to put out there, but just be honest. And why do you need to lie and use, science is true whether it happens to agree with your preconceived notions or not. And I find that, some of these companies are run by scientists that will use science to produce a product and then use incorrect science to justify why they're doing it. And I'm like, you don't get to pick and choose what science is right and lie about other stuff. Like, that's not right. And I think that if everybody sells their product, whatever it is, based on how awesome it is, rather than demonizing their neighbor or putting out misinformation around their neighbor, I'll be happy and I'll back off. But as long as they keep lying about it, I'm going to speak up, because it's not right, and people are being misled as to what is the best choice for them and the planet.
Yeah, I mean, it muddies the water, doesn't it? And it erodes people's faith in science at all. Because one week you hear one thing and the next week you hear another thing. And the amount of greenhouse gas produced by ruminants is not nothing. And so, discussing the actual number and what people are doing to, mitigate it, it seems like a good idea and a healthy discussion to have. And the fact that there's certain places, like in the UK, for example, where there's lots of grass and not much else could grow there, it's a bit of a no-brainer to put ruminants on there. But maybe there's other places where that's not the case, and there's you need to have discussions about what food is appropriate for that area. And
I got a lot of faith in farmers. I've not been to many farming areas where a farmer isn't growing the thing that is best suited to that environment, that is the best economic use of that land. I mean, that's basic farming. Yes. And so, I always hear, in America, the Midwest grows a lot of soy and corn. And in California, we're America too, we grow a lot of fruits and vegetables. It's not because we're like somehow more virtuous than the Midwest. Our environment is well suited to growing fruits and vegetables, and that's the best economic use of that land. And if Iowa could grow oranges and fruits and vegetables, they would, because that would be a better economic use of that land. But it snows, and corn is the best economic use of that land. And I think that in the case of Scotland and Ireland, pastoral land, that's going to be the best economic use of that land. And if you took off those animals, what would you do with that land? And for the most part, when you're working on land that has no other human food purpose, that land would just not get used for human food anymore. And that might be a situation that's fine for someone that has plenty of food, but I think you have to look at the global implications of that. So I've seen some, things, let's get rid of all animal agriculture by 2025. Okay, well, let's look what that might look like in terms of where we're going to replace all that animal source food with, in terms of micronutrients and protein. What are we going to do with the million or billion smallholder farmers in the developing world that are 100% reliant on animal agriculture for their livelihood? And what are we going to do with the land that was being basically manicured by ruminants, that now is going to be growing cellulose and nothing will go? And so you're going to have none of the ecosystem services that were provided by that land provided anymore. And I think, if you go to the extreme and kind of think about what that might look like what would Australia look like without sheep and cattle? I don't know. I don't know what the economy would look like. I think it would be pretty messy, because that's obviously New Zealand would be in a world of hurt if they couldn't have dairy and sheep. And I would imagine Scotland, if you took out all of those pastoral industries, what would you do with all those farmers? They're not going to be able to grow orange trees or coffee, right? Because that's not your environment. And just that basic thing is so important for agriculture. You've got to grow what grows there and that you can make a living on as a farmer. Otherwise, there will be no farmers. And that, I mean, it's kind of basic, but sometimes it's like, well, we think our farmers should grow fruits and vegetables. Okay, well, what's your climate? You probably can grow some, but it probably makes sense to grow coffee in areas where coffee grows. And that it's just that it's what's it called, a local competitive advantage is an economics term that seems to, I guess if you've never grown food, maybe you don't appreciate how important the environment is as to what you can grow and what gets grown.
Sure. I think we can become single issue and a bit blinkered in what we're trying to achieve. And something I always think about is the writings of people like Weston A. Price and others who traveled the world looking at traditional cultures. And it's one of the things that informed how I changed how I ate. And the fascinating thing about, or one of the many fascinating things about those communities is that they were all metabolically really healthy. There was no sign of chronic illness. They had basically no tooth decay. All these indicators of really good micronutrient status and stuff like that. And they did it on extremely varied diets because in those days there was only so much, or in those types of cultures, there was only so much steering of the ship you could do as a society. So, the Inuits, they weren't growing oranges. They were hunting the seals that were about. And the people in the tropics were eating coconuts, fish, fruit from the trees. Plains Indians were hunting buffalo, and they all had excellent health. And by default, they had to use the food that was around them. And I think you can probably go a wee bit wrong trying to put a square peg in a round hole when it comes to food systems. I suppose that's not really a question. Yeah, the buffalo thing's interesting to me because I've heard people talk about maybe putting them back on the Great Plains. What do you think about that?
Well, instead of what?
Well, I don't know the geography very well, but I mean, I know that there's a so-called Dust Bowl in America, and I don't know if the kind of work that Alan
was a long time ago. that was during the Depression.
Okay, so it's all sorted now.
Well, ag science has helped with that. So one of the big things that helps with that is no-till agriculture, which has ironically been enabled in part by the GMO crops that allow you to basically sow right into the corn stubble from the year before. So I think that certainly soil health is important, and there's a lot of things, especially no-till agriculture, that's been done that's really important for that. But I guess if we're in a food surplus situation where we can rewild land, which is I think kind of what you're arguing for, to put buffalo on there, then we have to look at, okay, is that really the situation we're in, or are we? Because if we're not using that land for food production, then we have to make that food somewhere else. And I think that there are some countries that have a food surplus. But if you look at the imports and exports, there's a lot of food moves around the world, right? Mm. And so there has to be an appreciation of what the trade-offs would be associated with, for example, rewilding land. And I would argue the only way you can rewild land is to have the land that is in agriculture be very productive. And I think that's a shared value that I think almost everybody has, because we don't want any more land going into agriculture than what we already have. And yet we look at the projections of population. And so the only way that we can achieve feeding more people is by having more productive agriculture on the land we already have. But I do want to go back to your point about, the eating endogenous food or kind of the native populations. And I guess I have kind of having gone through agricultural science at uni, we did basically linear programming for animal nutrition, which is how we basically make up our rations for cows. And you put in all of the available feedstuffs and the nutritional breakdown of those feedstuffs and the cost. And then you put in, this is what a lactating cow's dietary requirements are on for day to day. And then basically the computer goes through and it goes, okay, well, I'm going to put in, 2 pounds of almond hulls because they're a good source of protein and they're the cheapest protein and it makes this ration that's perfectly balanced based on what we understand of the nutritional requirements of the cow. And that's basically kind of the way that I think about food is like there's a certain number of calories you need and a certain amount of protein and fats and blah, blah. And you need your brain's kind of doing that as hopefully if you're optimizing your diet to take in the feedstuffs that are in your budget that fit the nutritional requirements you have of the available feedstuffs that's there. And one, when it's not almond season here and almond hulls go out of the equation, then we might bring in, I don't know, brewer's grain or something and so I kind of think that we do that, but it doesn't seem quite as formalized with humans, and so we don't have the kind of the same study done at the nutritional level that you can do with a cow, where you can put her in a feed stuff and give her the same thing for 2 years and see what that does to her, whereas with humans we're kind of dealing with epidemiology and it's a lot messier, but I do think there are certain basic requirements in terms of fat and protein and micronutrients that you can get in many, many different ways. And so long as your diet does that for you and you're not, deficient, then eat what you want, if you've got the availability of that. And I think that the tragedy is when there isn't the availability and people don't actually have the things they need to have normal, healthy brain development. And I think those cases are where I think that really we need to look at what those malnutrition is. That's really kind of my passion as to how we can address those deficiencies in countries with food insecurity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I feel like it should be a larger priority more widely. I'm showing my ignorance with the Dust Bowl comment. I was thinking about Alan Savory. I don't know if you're aware of his foundation. He kind of advocates for a very careful introduction of ruminants into semi-desertified areas in order to, through the process of them eating what vegetation's there and then their manure and sort of cultivating a soil landscape. Do you think there's much hope for turning at the moment unusable land into usable land through that sort of system?
Yeah, getting beyond my understanding of things, just because as I mentioned, I'm a geneticist in that regard. Yes. But I will say this about I see this comment a lot about grass-fed beef. If you've got an environment that allows you to feed animals grass all year, and I think Scotland's probably one, that's a great solution. If you live in a desert like me, where grass lives for about 2 months in the spring, doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
To have animals on grass all year when there's no grass growing 10 months of the year. Like, they have to eat something. And, people understand they have to water their lawns for their lawn to live. I don't know why they can't follow that thought through and go, well, if I'm requiring my cows to eat grass and there's no grass growing for 10 months a year, if there's no water, then that's probably not the best solution for raising cattle in that particular environment. And so, New Zealand, perfect place to raise raised dairy. California, no, actually not. We have a Mediterranean environment. And so if your lawn isn't growing, there's nothing for the cows to eat either. And if you go to the Midwest in the middle of winter and there's this much snow on the ground, they're not going to be grass-fed either. And so just the basics that humans understand, the environment changes, but somehow with agriculture, they want this kind of nirvana that doesn't even make sense in the environment that they're raised in. And so I think it's important to think about realistically, can you grow whatever it is you're growing locally? And if there's a competitive advantage to grow it somewhere else, then maybe it makes sense to trade in that case. And there's this argument that everything should be grown locally, and it's like, well, it depends. You're going to be limited if that's the case in many places. And is that really the best use of that land if you're growing something that's not well suited to that environment?
Yeah, that makes sense. You spoke earlier about GMO allowing potentially allowing people to use less in the way of chemicals. What do you think is the threat from chemicals used in agriculture, and what do you think the potential is for replacing them with genetically modified plants or animals?
The animals one's a complicated one. I mean, I think that the narrative around chemical use in agriculture is so out of whack with the reality. And if you look at, like, in the 1950s, at the toxicity of chemicals that were used in agriculture relative to today and the amount that's used, it's been this precipitous drop in both toxicity and amount to the basically using the safest products that we can, because almost all of the dangerous ones have either been replaced with something better or and have been banned, and so they're no longer being used. And yet people hang on that narrative as if we're still using really dangerous chemicals, and I just don't think the data support that. And it's interesting, there's a Bruce Ames who developed the Ames test for whether something gives you cancer by feeding a whole bunch of something to a rat, and when 50% of them got cancer, that was kind of what's called the LD50. And he has this really classic paper that says 99.99% of all the pesticides that you eat in your diet is naturally derived from the dietary ingredients themselves, because plants naturally produce insecticides because they don't want to be eaten by anything. That's why some plants taste bitter. And those chemicals, if you feed them to rats, are just as carcinogenic, if not more, than many of the artificial herbicides and insecticides. Or insecticides are worse than herbicides for the most part. But it's the dose that you're eating them in that isn't poison, because the dose makes the poison. And in fact, it's thought that some of the eat more fruits and vegetables. I think that's a commonly said thing in terms of health, and I totally agree with that. I think that the data on that is about as strong as any epidemiology of dietary data is eat more fruits and vegetables. Part of the reason they think that's healthy is because of the level of these naturally occurring compounds in these products, which are actually pesticides if you use that definition, right? And so, but they're natural, and so they kind of get a clean pass. And so if you're not eating fruits and vegetables because you're worried about artificial pesticides, you are doing your body a disservice, because there's nothing that's been shown in the epidemiology to be better than trying to increase fruit and vegetable consumption.
Then how about the persistence of antibiotics and hormones in beef? Should that be a concern?
Well, when you say the persistence of antibiotics, what antibiotics are we talking about?
Well, you tell me. In my limited understanding, if a cow, for example, a dairy cow gets an infection on their udders, or in their in that area, then they can be given antibiotics, but they're usually separated out so that they're not being milked during that time. That's my very basic understanding of how most dairy farms work. But you get more general concerns that people who are listening might have around antibiotic use in beef production, and hormones is something that I know nothing about, but I hear a lot. So I don't even know if it's based in any fact whatsoever.
All right, well, there's a couple of questions there. So let's start with antibiotics. So you quite correctly said that if a cow gets mastitis, which is an infection of the mammary gland, that if you're depending on the production system you're in, and actually technically in all production systems, you're meant to give her therapy to treat that disease. And I know I can speak to this as a mammal myself, and I got mastitis when I was nursing my kids. And I've never been so happy to take an antibiotic in my life, because it's incredibly painful, and it was miraculous how quickly that antibiotic was able to take care of that bacterial infection in my breast, in my case. So the farmer will treat that. Typically a quarter is what gets affected. And then there's what's called a withdrawal time, where that cow has to be taken out of the milking string, and her milk has to be dumped until that has cleared. So similar to when I took antibiotics, they put it in and then it kills the bacterial infection. And then it depends on the antibiotic, but let's say it's a week, 7 days later, she can go back in the milk supply. And then the cows get milked. And then at least in the US, and I'm not sure the situation in Scotland, every tanker of milk that goes to the creamery gets tested for antibiotics. And if there's residue of antibiotics at a violative level, gets dumped. So there's some level. So it is illegal to sell milk with antibiotics in it, and there are safeguards in place to prevent that from happening. And I guess as someone that cares about cows, she deserves to get her illness treated. The same way that I did, and I actually fed my kids still when I was taking it because the doctor said that was fine. I think that we have to be, if we care about animal welfare, we have to be able to treat sick animals. And so that concern, I think, is not, a legitimate one, because we already have measures in place to keep that product out of the market, and it is illegal to sell milk with antibiotics in it. And so when you see milk, the antibiotic-free milk, that's big business tricking you, because all milk is antibiotic-free. Then the hormones is a different question. So in dairy cow production, you bet she's producing hormones. That is why women and cows lactate, right? If you didn't have hormones, you wouldn't get pregnant and you wouldn't lactate. And so, yes, she produces hormones, and that's part of milk. Artificial hormones, if that's what you're talking about, which somehow are different and bad, in no way whatsoever different, are not allowed to be used in dairy cows in the UK. So recombinant bovine somatotropin or bovine growth hormone isn't allowed to be used. And due to fear-mongering in the US, it's no longer used in US dairy cattle production either. And so that is another technology that's been taken off the market due to misinformation. And as a result, our environmental footprint of our milk production is up about 7% relative to what it could have been. So, yeah, okay. So own that, people, marketers that took that product off the market. You own that 7% because you created that 7%. And you also probably have disencouraged further research into that type of an area, because who's going to risk having that happen to their product? So own those trade-offs. Then the other one that you mentioned was hormones in beef production. And in the UK, you're not allowed to use hormones in beef production. And so in beef cattle, quite often in the feedlot, in that last 90 days, they'll get an implant, which is a steroid implant, typically like testosterone or estrogen, the cow equivalent thereof, which increases their efficiency, so their rate of gain, so feed to gain, which is the thing we've been talking about all the time here. So we do this through selection a lot. That's actually why chickens grow 4 times faster than they used to, because we've selected chickens that more efficiently convert feed into gain, because they probably have higher levels of hormones, because that's what we've selected for, but it's natural. So, but if you look at the levels of hormones in the meat, it's minuscule amounts different relative to the natural hormones that those animals produce, and they're not biologically active in humans. Having said that, I believe this is still true, that the EU will not accept hormone-treated meat in its imports from the US. And so we have a supply in the US that doesn't get hormone-treated, that grows less efficiently, that increases the environmental footprint of food production. So thanks, Europe, just to ship to Europe so that they won't have hormone-treated meat. So that one, I think, again, is kind of an issue that's not a food safety issue, it's a public perception issue. And as a result of absence, not using that, you've increased the environmental footprint of your food production for no benefit in food safety. So you haven't really had a win there, in my opinion, but you've basically taken away access to a safe technology for producers. Wow,
yeah. Yes, stark listening there. I think it's really interesting to hear. Moving in another direction, because I was thinking a lot about fish production in Scotland in the last year or two. The journalist Joanna Blythman's written a lot about the state of fish farms, particularly salmon. Such a big export in Scotland, and the fish farms now are stuffed to the point that I think the mortality rate is up to a quarter in some of them, and there's a lot of lice, and there's real problems at the moment with sustainably farming fish. I know you've done a bit of work on AccuAdvantage salmon, so-called. It's a genetically engineered fish. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So there's a lot in that question as well. I should, in the interest of full disclosure, my husband works in aquaculture, so I do know a little bit about fish. But so basically, what you described was in Scotland that you see is they're salmon, Atlantic salmon, that are raised in open net pens in the ocean. So the fish are out in the ocean in a net pen, and there's the ability for things to move back and forth with the wild fish, and that's where the sea lice is. And I don't know if you look up sea lice, Google it and look at them. They're these horrible parasites that can attach the fish, and they can go both ways. So the native fish can bring them into the wild fish, to the aquaculture fish, and vice versa.
Okay. So
there's issues with net pen based aquaculture, which is the sea lice, disease transmission both ways from wild fish and vice versa. And also if there's too much feed to the fish, you get environmental contamination underneath the pens in terms of there's too much nutrients going in there. And so one of the solutions to that is to actually bring aquaculture out of the open ocean and bring it into land-based systems. And it's a little bit like making agriculture out of fish. And the problem with fish, of course, is they need water. You can't just bring them and put them in a feed yard. And so you can put them, especially Atlantic salmon, they can live in fresh water and salt water. And so you can raise them in recirculating tanks, recirculating water tanks, where the fish basically it is in some ways analogous to a feedlot, because you've got them sitting there in a contained area, and you drop food on their heads and they eat it, and then they grow rapidly because they don't have to go forage for their own fish, and then you can get them to market. And the advantage of the AccuAdvantage salmon is it's also an Atlantic salmon that has an additional piece of DNA from the Pacific salmon, which are over here on the west coast, that enables them to get to market weight in half the time.
Wow.
And so they don't get twice as big, they get to market weight in half the time. So about 18 months instead of 3 years.
On the same amount of feed?
On the same, actually less feed, because if you live for 3 years versus a year and a half, you need more in the 3 years to keep you going, just it's called metabolic maintenance energy. In other words, every day you're alive, you need, 2,000 calories or something. Yep. And so if you're alive longer, you need that maintenance energy longer. If you can get an animal to market weight in a shorter amount of time, whether it's a broiler, a chicken, or a fish, from an economic perspective as a farmer, that's a better solution, because feed's about 70% of animal agriculture costs. So anything you can do to reduce feed is going to be economically desirable. And so with the AccuAdvantage salmon, it's more feed efficient. It's a Prius, if you will, instead of a Hummer, and you can get it to market weight more rapidly. And that kind of helps with the economics of putting in these land-based systems. And conceptually, and this is what the company is doing now, you could grow those fish anywhere. So long as you had access to clean water and power, you could grow them in London or in Glasgow or wherever. You don't need the ocean anymore. And so it provides a potential approach to providing fresh fish in a way that enables it to be grown locally. So I just actually had some Scottish salmon the other day at a restaurant here, and that thing had been flown all the way from Scotland, and I can't imagine what its environmental footprint would be. And so, is this a better approach or a different approach that complements the current approaches? And I think that it shouldn't be taken off the table arbitrarily because Greenpeace doesn't like GMOs. That doesn't make any sense. it can be a yes and, like this is another way, because if you look at demand for particularly fish, it's projected to go up quite high, and we've basically, we don't have more capture fisheries to harvest, and so the only way we're going to produce more is through more efficient aquaculture. And so if we can do it on land, then is that not a yes and? Can we do that as well as what we currently do, and rather than just say no? Because that saying no doesn't solve anybody's problems, and that's, I guess, I've if someone's got a better idea, let's hear it. But if your solution to a problem is just to say no, how did that help? You didn't help anybody. And so I'm happy to hear anybody's ideas as to how it can help, but not just say no.
Yeah. And what do you think the ideal food would be for farmed salmon like that? You know, so that, is there a way to feed salmon effectively that doesn't compete with humans?
Yeah, well, the problem with salmon is that they're piscivores, so they require fish to eat. So some fish are herbivores, so they eat plants, so like grass carp, that they eat grass. So what you need to do is provide them with a feed source that's compatible with their metabolism. And there's actually some really interesting work being done in Australia. So one of the things that you eat salmon for, at least if you're a nutritionally aware person, is that they have really high levels of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. That's kind of one of the health benefits. And so they don't make them. They're like us. They can't make long-chain omega. They have to get that in their diet. And the diet typically provides that through marine algae that are eaten by smaller fish that are eaten by salmon. And so it comes through the diet. And there's some work in Australia where they've actually made, ironically, genetically engineered canola that has high levels of omega-3 fatty acids that potentially could be used as a blend in fish feed that would perhaps release some of the pressure on the fish that are being used in the diet and still give you that beneficial health impact of the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. And so I think there's some developing technologies coming along that could help with the providing the feed source for those fish that would still result in a healthy product, but wouldn't have the environmental degradation associated with basically harvesting random fish to feed the fish that we're going to eat.
Interesting.
So,
I've seen the there's a few high oleic acid canola type oils now, and I'm very interested in that area. I've recorded the podcast, it's not out yet, with an American guy called Tucker Goodrich, who's a kind of citizen scientist, but he's dug up a lot of papers around linoleic acid. And there's a question in health circles around, you know, is it just a matter of getting the omega-3 to omega-6 balance right, or do the absolute amounts matter? And it seems like the absolute amounts do matter. So with the canola oil, sometimes you get a lot of omega-3 relative to the old canola oils, but you also still have a lot of linoleic acid. And what I'm waiting for is for there to be lots of omega-3 and very little of the omega-6.
Oh. You have to go talk to the Australians and have that happen, because of course the omega-6 is a substrate that the omega-3 enzymes work on. So you would have to go, usually those are in some sort of an equilibrium. So it's hard to, so you'd have to get an enzyme that converted it but didn't convert back when the equilibrium changed. So
I see, yes. Yeah, there's not many edibles that have a one-to-one kind of thing. You know, beef and lamb tend to have a very, you know, sort of almost a one-to-one ratio, right? In
for omega-3s?
Yeah,
no,
you get a little bit, right?
Kind of pathetic. Beef and lamb are pretty pathetic for omega-3s. I mean,
sure, they're not rich sources, but if you look at the amount of omega-6 compared to omega-3, it's about 1-to-1, maybe 2-to-1.
So that's just basically a function of the bugs, right? So the omega, so the bugs, they desaturate the snot out of everything. That's their job, is like, you give nice unsaturated fatty acids to cows or ruminants and the bugs just saturate everything. That's why, for the most part, animal products have, at least ruminants, have high levels of saturated fat. And the omega-3, omega-6 is just little trace bits that's left that the bugs didn't get to, basically.
Yes. And in our tissues, it seems that omega-6 competes with omega-3, and if their tissues are flooded with omega-6, then it can be a problem. So that people who eat lots of beef don't notice an issue with linoleic acid, problems caused by linoleic acid. But if you have a lot of pork or chicken or canola oil that's got a lot of linoleic acid in it, then you could see problems. But I think it depends on the person. It depends on the what else they're eating as well. And there's some fascinating stuff. I've seen a couple of studies about young offenders in the Netherlands. It were given in a randomized controlled trial, either fish oil or placebo, and they're the ones who got the fish oil. The rates of violence went way down, and the sort of hypothesis is that the omega-3 was then outcompeting the omega-6 in their diet, which is fairly rich in most Western human diets, and improved their health, including their mental health, to the point that their rates of violence went down. It's fascinating stuff, and it's an area that's talked about all the time now. Omega-3, omega-6 kind of balance, and it's one of the reasons that I'm reluctant to eat much in the way of salmon for a rich source of omega-3, and now I tend to go for mackerel, which is usually fairly sustainable and abundant around the waters here, and delicious and cheap.
Well, you said the important things there, delicious, right? So I think everything in moderation. Grandma was right.
Well, it's been really fascinating chatting to you, and I really appreciate you coming on. Where can people find you? Where do you want them to find you?
Well, I have a Twitter account, so biobeef, so BIOBEEF. And then I have a faculty page that has some fun videos and talks a little bit about animal biotechnology. So that's, Alison, if you look, I have a blog there, biobeef blog. If biotechnology at UC Davis, you'll find me for the most part. So that's kind of where I hang out.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks again.
Okay, you're welcome. Bye.